I will start the recording. I will start the recording. Yes, please.
Okay. I would like to welcome you at our webinar. In the name of Aphrodite NGO, I would like to welcome our prestigious guests, Lord Ming Campbell and Lord Alexander Carlyle. The term terrorist is first used in 1794 by the French philosopher François Noël. Although the term is not subjected to universal agreed definition, as we know, terrorist is the use of international violence for political or religious purposes to spread fear. These attacks can be on innocent victims to put a third party under pressure to change a policy or a position. There are also types of terrorism. Some of them are civil disorder, political terrorism, and non-political terrorism.
There is too much terrorism in the Middle East, and we must seek to reduce it, but it must be in global perspective. Consider our own government's reports on global terrorism. In the 5 years, the tragedy of targeting innocent civilians in the Middle East was the leading region in the number of terrorists. Trend in the Middle East moved upward every single year. It moved downward in other regions. The Middle East had the most incidents of terrorism of any region around the globe.
At first, I would like to introduce Lord Campbell, CH, CBE, PC, QC, KT. He was the Member of Parliament for North East Fife from 1987 to 2015. He was the leader of the Liberal Democrats from 2 March 2006 until 15 October 2007. At last, former athlete from 1961 until 1974 with a lot of accomplishments. Please, Lord Campbell. Please unmute. We're not hearing you now.
Got it. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to join you. This is an occasion where the focus is on terrorism. And of course, Lord Carlyle, who is to follow me, is a very considerable expert in that area. I am not, and do not pretend to be, but between us, we thought it might be helpful if I were to give, if you like, a bird's eye view from the United Kingdom of the Middle East in present circumstances. Some of these circumstances, of course, being, if you like, encouraging and possibly even the medium for terrorism. I should say, first of all, that I'm not a member of the government. I don't speak for the government. I don't even speak on behalf of my own party. I speak of myself. And in a discussion of this kind, I'm conscious that other participants will have scholarship, judgment, and experience which far outweighs mine. And that is why I offer, before I begin, these caveats. The Middle East is often a blanket description with people failing to understand just how broad a canvas it represents. And there are a number of areas in which I have a particular interest and where I think questions need to be asked and answers are needed urgently. I'm not sure how many of these answers I will have, but I hope that in posing the questions, I may encourage debate and that I will go away, if not wiser, then at least better informed. And any Brit who takes part in a discussion of this kind has, of course, to begin with the Balfour Declaration, which was made more than 100 years ago by United Kingdom government, and which many of us in politics in Britain regard as still carrying a moral obligation. In its modern iteration, the Balfour Declaration is sometimes described in the shorthand of the need for a two-state solution in relation to the arrangements between Israel and the Palestinians. And those who support the two-state solution have to accept two principles. The first, that Israel is entitled to recognition and to live in peace within recognized borders. And the second, that the Palestinians are similarly entitled to a viable recognized state with territorial integrity based on the land now occupied and generally accepted as illegally occupied in 1967. And so my question in relation to these circumstances is in three parts. Is this still a legitimate ambition? To which I would hope the answer is yes. Is it an ambition capable of achievement? And I would answer that by saying it has to be if there is any hope for a settlement which will be of a lasting and equitable nature. And the third is, do any of the current proposals meet those necessary requirements? And in that respect, I fear not. The American plan, published on the 28th of January, running to 181 pages, is generally accepted as having been favorable to the Palestinians, favorable to the Israelis, but not to the Palestinians. And I would put it perhaps, looking at from outside, that I find it difficult to conceive that any Palestinian leader could possibly accept the terms of these proposals. Not least, of course, and to some extent I've referred to this already, it accepts that the lands occupied by the now settlers on the West Bank should remain with Israel. I've already referred to the issue of legality. Palestinians would be excluded from East Jerusalem, and for example, security, territorial waters, airspace, all of these would be under Israeli control. And the question, which I think is the live one now, is whether these views have been altered in any respect by the rapprochement recently announced between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. That was, of course, and it is only fair to acknowledge, a very considerable political achievement for Mr. Netanyahu and President Trump. And the question now is whether or not there will be more and similar arrangements with other Arab states. My criticism is that it makes no contribution to the wider peace to which I've referred in relation to the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And of course, Mr. Netanyahu has not given up his ambition to annex illegally parts of the West Bank, only agreed to suspend the claim. And meanwhile, of course, the annexation of the Golan Heights remains on the agenda. My question, therefore, am I wrong to see that these events are deeply damaging, even fatal, to the two-state solution, that they render irrelevant the United Nations resolutions of long ago, 242 and 364? I've dwelt on this issue to some extent because I think in the United Kingdom we have at the very least a moral obligation. But arising out of what I've just said, I've got two more questions. Is there now a widespread common interest in the region to create a political alliance designed to counter the influence of Iran? How far will this go? And indeed, are the Palestinians to pay the price for such an alliance? Let me turn to another issue which is urgent in the minds of people in the United Kingdom, and that is, in whose possible interests can the deadlock over Yemen be? A deadlock which, with crippling consequences for its citizens, hunger, disease, war, conflict, and of course, more recently, the impact of the virus, described recently by the United Nations as the world's worst humanitarian disaster. Is there no way of breaking out of this terrible circle which has enmeshed the people of Yemen with these quite staggering consequences, which we see in the United Kingdom pretty well every evening in film on our national news bulletins, which is, to put it mildly, horrifying. You'll be aware that in colonial times, European countries had influence, often unhealthy influence, in the Middle East. But that influence, of course, has faded with self-determination. Perhaps the cynics would say, save in the matter of arms sales. A vacuum has been created, filled by Russia, asserting its Cold War relationship, its long-standing Cold War relationship with Syria once again. And questions remain about Russian military efforts in Syria, the targeting of schools and hospitals and things of that kind. And that poses, or leads me to pose a further question. How will the increasingly successful Assad campaign play out in Syria? And at what further cost to civilians and opponents? And in particular, how will Syria be rebuilt? Who will pay for it? Is there any prospect of implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2254, calling for a ceasefire, a political settlement, and the need to oblige to international humanitarian law? Talking of Syria takes me to refugees. In the American document that I referred, there is no reference to the right of return in relation to any of the refugees, no reference in the discussion between Israel and, or the purported discussion between Israel and the Palestinians, which of course the Palestinians had no part. And so the refugee issue in that context remains unresolved. But look around elsewhere. There are refugees in several Middle East countries. I pick in particular Turkey, largely from Syria, used quite often by Mr. Erdogan as a threat when he seeks to obtain some kind of concession from the European Union. The country with which the United Kingdom has always and retains a particular relationship is at Jordan. United Nations estimates that there are something like 650,000 refugees in Jordan from Syria, causing a strain on the government and strain on the economy. And the question which one must necessarily ask, for how long can Jordan cope with that? What are the long-term consequences for the stability of that country? And one last set of statistics, these from the Brookings Institute, who've done an analysis of those countries in which humanitarian aid is currently required and not available. In Syria, that figure amounts to 13.5 million inhabitants. In the Yemen, 21.1 million. In Libya, 2.4 million. And Iraq, 8.2 million. Who will provide that humanitarian aid and research as the United Nations has been forced to scale back its operations in these countries? The conclusion which I reach is, given the uncertainties and the competing interests to which I have just outlined, then there is an atmosphere which one might describe as conducive to terrorism. And that is why the analysis of my very good friend Alex Carlile, I hope, will provide, if not answers to these questions, at least an illustration of the extent to which these uncertainties may be exploited for terrorist purposes.
Thank you, Lord Campbell, for your intervention. Now I would like to present Lord Alexander, CBE QC FRSA, who is a British barrister and a crossbench member of the House of Lords. He was a member of the parliament from 1983 to 1997. Between 2001 and 2011, he was an independent reviewer of terrorism legislation and independent reviewer of the government's prevent strategy. Lord Alexander, Lord.
Sorry about that. I'll start again. Thank you very much. And I want to start by saying what an enormous pleasure it is to be back with you in Beirut, though I wish I was there physically. I enjoyed my last visit to your city wonderfully and was absolutely gutted by the tragedy that has beset you at a time when the country's economy was already looking troubled, to put it mildly. Lord Campbell and I have shared our views over many years. Indeed, for a number of years, we shared an office in the House of Commons, and I agree with him about most things. And I certainly agree with the purport of what he has said. Just dipping into what he said about Israel and the Palestinians. I am one of those who believes that there should be a two-state solution. I'm also a believer in talking, and it may well be that the parties in this dispute will have to go on talking for a very long time indeed. In the history of the United Kingdom, certainly of England, the Scots, and Lord Campbell is of course a Scot, tend to do these things quickly and more brutally. There has been a 30 years war. And maybe Israel and Palestine need a 30-year conversation before we reach the two-state solution. My reflection on that two-state solution is that it does not have to be the vertical solution, which many people think of and assume is meant by the two-state solution. Having been there and studied it and talked to people on both sides, seems to me that in the end, there may have to be a two-state horizontal solution, by which I mean a cantonal solution in which the inevitability, I think, of sharing Jerusalem is part. But it will not be done whilst Mr. Netanyahu is the Prime Minister of Israel, nor when Mr. Trump is the President of the United States, nor whilst MBZ is ruling the UAE, I'm afraid. Turning directly to terrorism, I always remind myself when I'm talking about terrorism that it is an evolutionary subject. I can illustrate that very starkly by one example. When Nelson Mandela entered prison, he was a terrorist. When he left prison, it was to be the president of the country that had sentenced him to a very long sentence, decades in prison, for being a terrorist. Things change. And I will give another example in a moment from nearer home for me. Shortly before 2010, the UK government asked me to prepare a report on the definition of terrorism in UK law. I thought it was my moment to be a great law reformer when I was asked to do it. In fact, it wasn't. I suggested only minor changes to the law, particularly related to protecting religions. But I spent a lot of time looking at other countries' terrorism laws. Indeed, I carried out a review of every single piece of terrorism legislation in the whole world, something like 140 to 150 sets of legislation. The conclusion I reached was an unhappy one, which is that many countries have very good black letter written terrorism laws, but many of the countries with the best laws have the worst record of applying those laws, because although they have the law, they do not have the rule of law, which provides civilized standards for dealing with alleged terrorist offenders and groups. And we have to bear in mind that evolution and political changes that can take place, indeed that do take place, when we consider the broader issue of terrorism. I will give you an example from nearer. People sometimes get annoyed abroad when Brits start talking about what happened in Northern Ireland, but it is very instructive. Indeed, nobody gets crosser than the Israeli government, actually, when one reminds them of what has happened in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland had extremely unpleasant and tendentious political issues, which lasted approximately 310 years until 1998. On the 10th of April, 1998, in the constituency which was then represented by Lord Campbell, agreement was reached. Lord Campbell is the Chancellor of St Andrews University, the oldest university, I think, in the United Kingdom, maybe the second oldest, at which I am now an honorary professor. It's a great university in a very small and beautiful city. The Good Friday decommissioning of weapons, which may have some resonance in your country, demilitarization, justice, and policing. The parties to that deal were a government which is Republic of Ireland, the British government, particularly the Northern Ireland part of British government, which is heavily devolved, and also the United States played a part as a sort of honest broker. But as a result, an agreement was reached which brought terrorists into government. And indeed, I, and I'm sure Lord Campbell, know personally a number of people who were household names for their terrorist activity in Northern Ireland, who have been, and some still are, respected constitutional politicians in Northern Ireland. And the provisional IRA, PIRA, converted itself in every way to a constitutional party, Sinn Féin, and indeed most Sinn Féin members of the Northern Ireland Parliament, the Legislative Assembly, are now people far too young to have been involved in terrorism in those days, and are mostly very bright young graduates who've joined Sinn Féin because they believe in its constitutional ambitions. It was validated, the Good Friday Agreement was validated by a referendum which took place in two countries, Ireland and in Northern Ireland. Since that time, there have been difficult moments, but the landscape of Ireland as an island has been changed completely. Two nations, the United Kingdom and Ireland, have united in the resolve to ensure that there is peace. You'll be aware of the very difficult issue of Brexit, the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, and the most difficult issue to this day, which has resulted in Mr. Johnson's government presenting a bill to Parliament, which even possibly might mean Britain breaking a treaty obligation, is designed to ensure that peace continues in Ireland. And as a result, several new institutions have been created, and the issues that have continued for 310 plus years have mostly been resolved. It's a lovely place to live. Industry is doing well, has the best schools in the United Kingdom. I once had to have some emergency dentistry, and I was glad I was in Belfast, not in London, when it was necessary. The health service is better there. And it has proved that terrorism can be converted into political constitutional institutions. And you may have gathered in saying that I have something particularly Lebanese in mind, because what I'm saying is really not very subtle, is it? Organizations that hold arms for a political reason or for a mixed political and military reason, which are held separate from the state, cannot be regarded by the international community as legitimate. There are many different types of government system in the world, but no government system recognizes a state within a state. And my belief is that the biggest contribution that could be made to your country would be for Hezbollah to become a constitutional organization analogous to what the Irish Republican Army did. So I now turn back to the definition of terrorism. Well, as I said, I was asked to look at the definition of terrorism, and I tried to find a common definition that everyone would agree about. So being a moderately informed person, I thought I'd better go to the United Nations in New York, because there is a committee at the United Nations which is seeking to find a definition of terrorism. Well, when I got there over 10 years ago, that committee had been sitting for 25 years and had failed to reach a definition of terrorism. And it would be no surprise to you to know that they still have not done that. So I turned to the world academic community. And there are many academics who are interested in terrorism, and they have sought to provide a single definition of terrorism. But at the time I last looked at it, it had 105 separate paragraphs, and it was actually incomprehensible as a definition. It was more like a menu in a very large takeaway restaurant in which you could put together what you liked and call it a definition of terrorism. I think what we can agree, I hope we can agree, is that the use of violence or the threat of violence to influence the government or to intimidate a section of the public is properly regarded as terrorism. The use of violence or the threat of violence to influence the government or to intimidate a section of the public. That is the common thread of all the black letter law around the world. Plus, that it should be done for a political, religious, or ideological cause. After 9/11, the then Secretary General of the United Nations took urgent action, and as a result, the United Nations agreed that it should be an international crime to do terrorist acts. Terrorism is not a crime in the United Kingdom. It's the terrorist acts that are the crime. So there are many acts of terrorism that are different crimes here, and that's a similar pattern in most jurisdictions. So it was decided that if, for example, an act of terrorism was committed in, let's say, Ulaanbaatar, and the terrorists who had committed it were in Manchester, England, that would be triable in Manchester, England, before the British courts there, because it was decided that the world agreed through the UN that terrorism was an international set of crimes which needed to be tried internationally in the most convenient place, the locus conveniens, to throw in a couple of words of Latin, which we lawyers learn at our mother's knee. Now, the other thing that has happened in relation to terrorism is that lists of proscribed, forbidden organizations have been created in different countries. They're not the same in every country. For example, the British list and the American list are different in some respects. In the United Kingdom at the moment, there are 76 international terrorist organizations, as the government calls them, proscribed, banned under the Terrorism Act 2000. I'll just give you some examples, because some of them will be familiar to you. Oh, what's happened to my picture? Sorry, I'm back on. I nudged the wrong button. They include the Abdallah Azam brigades, which have had a connection with Lebanon because a rocket attack was launched from Lebanon into northern Israel in August 2013. Abu Nidal, the Al-Ashtar brigades, Al-Gamat al-Islamiyah, Al-Muhajirun, which is part of that organization, the Al-Mukhtar brigades, including Saraya al-Mukhtar. Hamas is al-Din al-Qassam brigades, Hamas, and I'll say a little bit more about Hamas in a moment. And reading from the list, one of the banned organizations in the UK as a terrorist organization is described as follows: Hezbollah, Party of God, proscribed March 2019. Hezbollah is committed to armed resistance to the State of Israel and aims to seize all Palestinian territories and Jerusalem from Israel. It supports terrorism in Iraq and the Palestinian territories. And then it adds, Hezbollah as a political entity in Lebanon has won votes in legitimate elections and forms part of the Lebanese government. It has the largest non-state military force. The UK government proscribed Hezbollah's external security organization in 2001. In 2008, the proscription was extended to include the whole of Hezbollah's military apparatus, namely the Jihad Council and all units reporting to it. And yet, many of those organizations, or at least some, have been doing some very legitimate and commendable work. Look at the situation with Hamas at the moment. Hamas, as I've just told you, is a banned organization in the United Kingdom. But in Doha, Qatar, at the moment, conversations are taking place, as has been reported at least, between Hamas and the Israeli government, which has a considerable informal presence in Doha, under the guidance of the Americans and being hosted by the government of Qatar. What has the result of that engagement been? Well, in all the fuss about the other agreement in the last few days, there was announced a ceasefire between Hamas and the State of Israel. And Israel has approved the humanitarian aid that is being given to Gaza by the government of Qatar, running in cost to billions of dollars, the purpose of which is quite simple: to give the citizens of Gaza electricity for the full day or as near as it can be managed, as opposed to at a maximum previously of 2 hours per day, or sometimes less than that. So here you have the evolution in action. Hamas is a terrorist organization in the eyes of the British law. But we know, of course, that those conversations that are taking place in Doha are not opposed by the government of the United Kingdom. If they were, they would say so. Now, that is not to say that the United Kingdom thereby is complicit in terrorism, far from it. What it is doing is allowing the situation to evolve so that those who are described as terrorists in law can, like the provisional IRA in Northern Ireland, become part of the legitimate government. So it doesn't mean no contact, it does mean evolution. But how should that evolution take place? I may be repeating myself now, but I'm going to be specific, if you'll forgive me, and I hope I will not offend anyone, about your great country and your extremely beautiful city of Beirut. If Hezbollah wishes your country, Lebanon, to have the aid of the international community, if in particular it wishes to have the support of the World Bank, if it does not wish to be dependent on some fairly unholy alliances which are taking place at the present time, including at the moment some military exercises happening in Russia, which include Russia, Iran, and Turkey, strange bedfellows, given that Turkey is a member of NATO, then surely there is a duty on Hezbollah to recognize that your country needs that international help, preferably through a neutral international organization like the World Bank, and to throw in its lot with the legitimate government of Lebanon to be part of the democratic family in the world by becoming part of the government of Lebanon and putting its arms under the supervision of the country's government. If that happened, my prediction is that international aid to help Lebanon, not just out of the explosion results, but out of the pre-existing economic problems, would come rushing into your country because it has so much to give as well as something to take. There can be no states within a state. So the definition of terrorism is not absolute. The conduct of terrorist organizations is not absolute. Some of them are beyond the pale. Some of them need probably to be wiped off the face of the earth as enemies of civilized life. But some can be brought into the comity, the friendship, the international family of nations. And I believe that whilst we are fighting terrorism on one front and preventing terrorism where we can on another front, we should also be trying to make something of the good intentions of some organizations regarded as terrorists for the benefit of the world, for the benefit of those countries that need some help from time to time. We all will in the world. So those are my reflections, and I hope a little bit of only gentle provocation. And I'd be very, very interested, as I know my friend Mingis Campbell will, to hear your contributions and to answer any points that you may have. And once again, Ahmad, thank you so much for arranging this event.
Thank you, Lord Alexander, for your intervention. Now we want to welcome the president of NGO, Dr. Ahmad Zain, to listen to his intervention about terrorism.
Thank you, Ala. Thank you, Lord Campbell, Lord Carlyle. Actually, I enjoyed very much your intervention. That's why I will try to be very fast because the questions have started to come. So I'm just going to give you what I'm going to say is an idea or thoughts of someone living in the Middle East. Actually, as Lord Campbell said, Lord Carlyle is a professional in terrorism. What he said is something I totally respect. My intervention will be four small parts. I want to start with terrorism and media. Actually, most definitions of terrorism recognize that terrorists don't just pursue violence for the sake of it, but have a specific purpose for carrying out their attacks. Individuals or groups may use terrorism, as we had seen in history, because they don't like the current organization of society and they want to change it. They may believe that violence or the threat of violence will coerce society into making a change. Throughout history, many terrorists have stated that they turned to violence after long deliberation because they felt they had no other choice. To be more realistic, the global war on terror that has been launched by the US administration in the aftermath of the September 11, the same exact day as today, has sparked a major debate over the definition of terror, its social and political problems. Media, according to many international reports, researchers, are the trigger to make terrorism in the form that we are seeing today. The main question is how far media coverage can meet journalistic standards of balance, truth, and objectivity, especially in cases of extreme political conflicts. How media is really exaggerating terrorism. Unfortunately, modern day terrorists are always trying to seek publicity about their existence and purpose through the media. This may include issuing statements, giving interviews, claiming responsibility for terrorist actions, or sending tapes to television states. This actually places extra burden on media to devise standards for dealing with those publicities. However, especially in the Middle East, unlike the situation a decade ago, when most Arab media systems were monopolized by governments and were abiding by the official line, today, unfortunately, the new Arab satellite channels are trying to cater to the market needs, to what the customers, their customers, the people watching or listening want to hear. They have to think about reaching the widest possible market, which is not limited to within their own boundaries. Okay, so the logic is no longer catering to the Egyptians or to the Saudis, but to the Arab. And unfortunately, media, they believe that they will gain more people listening, more customers when transmitting terrorist acts. In that sense, the media, the Arab media, are trying to find out what most Arab wants and what is the common denominator among most Arabs. Terrorism in the Middle East. My second small part is terrorism in the Middle East. Muslim worldwide, they confront multidimensional crises, including economic, political, educational, cultural, and social problems. The chronic problem of this region, such as authoritarian regimes, education, unemployment, and poverty, are easily manipulated by such radical terrorist organizations. The Middle East and terrorism are often used together in terrorism literature and have become synonyms with each other. Why? Because the Middle East, that is representing only 7% of the total land area worldwide, witnessed more than 90% of wars in the last 3 decades. Experts are right to claim that most of the radical terrorist groups stem from this region, and terrorism is not. But why? Why is this? Have we asked why this is happening? Is it because other regimes want to control the Middle East for the sake of fuel, as some European researchers say? I will go now to something, the third part, which is difference between terrorism and resistance. Resistance is not terrorism. Terrorism is not resistance. If I will take the case of Syria and Saudi Arabia, in Syria, a lot of countries, or a lot of Western countries are calling the Syrian regime as a terrorist regime, killing the people, his people. However, unfortunately, and if we go to the statistics, the media are not saying that more than 80% of the people dead from the opposition to the Syrian regimes are not Syrians. Most of the parties that are fighting the Syrian regimes are not parties, are not Syrians. So none of the media that I had spoken about at the beginning are highlighting this specific point. Why it is a terrorism regimes, while it's killing people, foreign people on their own land. On the other way, on the other side, if you compare to Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia, as Lord Campbell said about the war against Yemen and what's the number of people that are being dead. So why is this? It's called resistance, and this is not terrorism. So here we see difference. We see a lot of countries against the intervention of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, against the Saudi Arabia war, and as we see a lot of countries against the Syrian war. This is the difference in point of view. But for me, as a person interested in politics and monitoring the situation, I would ask a simple question: why it is okay for USA to defend its territory 6,677 miles away from their territory in Syria, and it's not allowed for Hezbollah or the Houthi to defend their territory on its border? This is a question that we really need to highlight. USA also is saying they're defending their territory in Iraq. It's again more than 7,000 miles away from USA. So is this legitimate for USA? And it's not legitimate for others. I go to the last part. Who created terrorism in the Middle East? It is a big dilemma. It's a big question. Actually, when I planned this webinar, this is something really I was thinking about. Is it an ideology or a clash of nations? Clash of nations, if we go back to a lot of studies about the Middle East and how it's supposed to happen. And September 17, 2006, I quote President Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton's comments today accusing Mr. Trump of treason are not only beyond the pale, it's also an attempt to distract from her horrible record on ISIS. If Clinton really wants to find the real cause of ISIS, she needs to take a long, hard look in the mirror. This is not somebody from Iran or Russia or China saying, this is someone from USA who is now the president of the USA. The decision to remove all American troops from Iraq in 2011, which was vigorously supported by Clinton, created the vacuum that led to the founding of ISIS. Again, I quote President Donald Trump. He meant exactly what he said when he called President Barack Obama the founder of ISIS, and objected when a conservative radio showed host tried to clarify the GOP nominee position. Let me be honest with you. For many Muslims, like myself, for the majority, I would say for the majority of Muslims, and I will speak on behalf of them, I will definitely be sure on behalf of them. It's hard to believe that a practicing Muslim person can kill children, or that the barbaric act and what happened in putting Jordanian pilots into fire was carried out in the name of religion or Islam. This is not what we have learned from Islam. This is why a large number of Muslims embrace conspiracy theory, claiming that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Taliban, the attacks of September 11 and Peshawar are actually the product of anti-Islamic forces. I cannot judge what is the truth or whether any of these conspiracy theories are right or wrong. But I know one thing, that whoever is committing such crimes is really making our lives hell, and is showing a bad image of Islam, since we are talking about the Middle East and the majority of people are Muslims. And I have never seen one sentence in the Quran that asks for killing other people. The only sentence that people will argue you about is an eye for an eye, but it's never your eye before his eye. Actually, let me finish by really saying what I really aim from this is to really try to make a small contribution to help actually peace in the Middle East, to help that we don't want to see any more murders like the ones we are seeing in the Middle East. Actually, and really, I have a lot of time of chats with Lord Alexander Carlisle, but to be very honest,
yes, I'm in the middle.
What you said today is something very valuable. I really appreciate what you said, because I know what's your aim is, the good for our country, and I know how much you love Lebanon and you want to see Lebanon in its best situation. Again, I hope this was beneficial for people who are watching, and or will watch in the future. Thank you, Lord Carlyle, Lord Campbell, for this marvelous contribution. And I hope we will have a very fruitful Q&A sessions.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Now it's the time for a question to Lord Campbell and Lord Alexander. Someone asked chat, a question from Ali Tarraf. If you want Hezbollah to join the army, do you think they will succeed? And especially that their strength is secret war?
Well, if I can pick that up, as I said earlier, I do not think it's acceptable in any country to have a state within a state. The era of private armies in most countries finished a very, very long time ago. Hezbollah is very powerful militarily. If it wants to be recognized as making a contribution to peace and to the prosperity of your country, then in my view, they will have to join with and in government. They may be very strong at waging secret war, but any well-organized country is good at waging secret war. I can give you examples of many countries which may not be physically very strong, but have very strong intelligence services.
Okay, thank you, Lord Alexander. There's also a question from Yusuf Khalifa. He's saying that some are saying that this current time in Lebanon is under pressure to get Hezbollah away from the government because they are saying it's a terrorist militia. What do you think about this point?
Ming, do you want to? You're on mute. You're on mute.
How would you do it, and how would you expect to do it? I mean, Hezbollah have survived for a very long time. It seems to me, and I'm afraid to go back to the Irish example, which Alex Carlyle described in some detail. The important thing to remember is that the two sides, if I could put it that way, the terrorists and the legitimate government, reached the same view. That they couldn't win, that's to say that they couldn't bomb their way to the conference table. And the legitimate government reached the view that it could not eliminate the IRA. And it was the fact that they both reached a similar conclusion which allowed there to be the ceasefire from which ultimately the settlement came. And just to pick up on a more general point, it's this, when elites are challenged, in some countries, they choose to meet that challenge by the use of by repression. And that inevitably has an impact upon those who are minded to try and bring about change by violent means. But the interesting thing is, and I've been thinking about this since we started this particular branch of the conversation, I cannot remember any terrorist organization which has succeeded in achieving social change by way of violence. Indeed, often when such movements are successful, then they are as repressive in their own way as the very administrations that they've sought to remove.
Lord Carly, what you think will not have the two-state solution with Trump, Netanyahu, and MBS? What about MBS?
Well, MBS is, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has rather mixed credibility around the world. If there is a change of presidency in the United States, I suspect that he'll look a much less powerful figure than he does now. And he's not looking a terribly powerful figure at the moment, other than his own country. But I think the bottom line here, and Aya Asef asked a relevant question here, do do you believe that the agreement between UAE and Israel would stand without participation in Palestine? It's the key question. How on earth can you reach a settlement when one of the two major parties is not at the settlement table? It's an absurd notion. There are all kinds of ways in which one could characterize or possibly mischaracterize the reasons why the United States and UAE, supported by one or two other countries, reached the agreement which was announced. One of the mischaracterizations, or not, and it's, I'd be interested in your view, is that it's electoral as far as Israel and the United States are concerned. But any serious suggestion, there is no serious suggestion that can be made that that agreement will bring about peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And I could just add something back to Ireland. One of the decisions that was made by the British government at the time and the Irish government at the time is that you brought to the table people who you knew had killed other and innocent people through terrorism, because as Lord Campbell said, they had discovered that they were not going to get their own way without some kind of settlement. Who's next?
There's another question. They're asking, do you think Hezbollah will face a day and will be gone away from Lebanon?
Well, my answer to that is no, there is no expectation of Hezbollah going away from Lebanon any more than there was ever an expectation that the provisional IRA in some form or another would go away from Northern Ireland and indeed from the Republic of Ireland, where Sinn Féin, the constitutional version, is a political party actively campaigning in elections. I think one has to be realistic and recognize that organizations like that, if they decide to become a constitutional contributor to the national polity, they have to contribute in a proper way, but one recognizes their background. I think that's perfectly acceptable. It sometimes means swallowing rather hard when you see somebody who is a former terrorist described as the Minister for Education or whatever it happens to be. But if it works, it works. And, one has to be both principled and to a degree pragmatic. Do you agree, Ming?
Yes, I do. And in fact, there's a very pragmatic illustration of it, because as you know, the United Kingdom is a monarchy, and the head of the monarchy is Her Majesty the Queen. And for many years, then it was the whole notion of monarchy, which was the subject of the IRA's campaign and the determination to take the whole of Ireland out of a monarchy. And what happened? We eventually had the site, to some surprise actually, but someone who had been well recognized as a leading figure in the IRA at a banquet in the palace, in Buckingham Palace in London, wearing what we call a white tie, the most formal of formal dress that you can imagine in the United Kingdom. There were some people who were upset by that, but there are others who said, well, look, we've made this thing work. And it all goes back, I think, to my slightly simplistic view, that the way that when there are people who are disaffected, if you have sufficiently robust systems to allow the legitimate expression of disaffection, then you will survive that. But when the response of the elite to those who wish to say something different is repression, then that inevitably gives support to those who still think that violence is a thing, and it certainly discourages those who believe, using something which is part of our system, but those who believe that a democratic approach or some form of expression of those who are not part of government but wish to change it if you have that, I'm repeating myself, then you have a much better chance of writing it out. It's when you repress people's legitimate aspirations that you give cover to those who want to do so who think, mistakenly, that you can bomb your way to the conference center. If I can do one other illustration. The United Kingdom had a lot of colonies. I made a brief reference to colonial past. One of them was in a place called Kenya in East Africa. There was a very strong terrorist operation going on in Kenya. The British government sent large sections of the British Army to deal with it. They couldn't deal with it because the terrorists could neither win nor could the British Army eliminate them. What did they do? They started talking to the leader. It's called Jomo Kenyatta. And so Kenya is now, albeit with some imperfections, a democratic society in which the legitimate democratic aspirations of citizens are available through the ballot box.
Can I add something to that? And this is specifically about your political system. In Northern Ireland, we have a system called the D'Hondt system, I think brought from, invented by a Belgian political specialist, in which all the parts of the community are automatically represented in government in Northern Ireland. It's not dissimilar to the system that you have in Lebanon, by which certain interests, Christians, Sunni, Shia, and so on, different sectors of society are represented by definition in the government and in the parliament. That can work extremely well, and it is frustrating to me that you have the beginnings of this, but you don't have the political will yet to create that kind of cooperative government. You will understand, I'm sure, what I mean when I say that one of the prerequisites of such a system is that corruption should be rooted out of government and should not be permitted in any way. We are told here, I don't know if it's true, I can't make the judgment, but we are told here by the media that there's a considerable amount of corruption in Lebanese government. If that is the case, that may well be the inhibition, and the only real inhibition, that is preventing people of reasonably goodwill from all the different political groups, including Hezbollah, from coming together. But I really, really would say to you as a plea that if you can do anything to bring Hezbollah to the political table, recognizing that they are a very powerful force with a very important part to play, potentially, in a legitimized Lebanese government, then the rest of the world will not only be very pleased, but is likely to come out and help you much more than they have been willing to at the moment. And although President Macron of France has been trying very, very hard to provide some assistance to Lebanon, France can't do it on its own, and it won't. It needs the building blocks to be put in place for a much more, let's call it democratic, doesn't have to be a pure democracy, as it were, but a more democratic system of government in Lebanon, but an incorruptible system.
Could I just make a point about corruption that Alex Carlile has quite properly made, and it's this. If you want inward investment, if you want foreign companies to come and invest and to assist in the economy, and indeed, if you like, the enormous problems now caused recently by the explosion, which we all regret so much, then if there's a hint of corruption, they will find it very difficult to do so. Once upon a time they would, but now domestic economy, particularly the United Kingdom, has very strong anti-corruption legislation. And so for any company thinking of investing abroad, it has to recognize that it may be subject to prosecution and fines if it indulges in corruption abroad, which is prevented and made illegal by the law in the country, namely the United Kingdom, in which it has its base.
They are adding on this question, they're saying if peace is done between Iran and America, does Hezbollah will stay in Lebanon, or they will still face Israel?
I'm not sure that I entirely understand that question, actually, but
They're
Iran.
saying if Iran and America have done peace in between them, does Hezbollah will stay against Israel, or you think they will get out of that war or facing point?
Actually, you have to ask Hezbollah.
Ming, you're a foreign policy expert.
Well, I mean, we know that there was a relationship between the United States and Iran, and it was in the nuclear deal, which President Obama supported, but of course was immediately the subject of revocation when President Trump came to office. And it has had a very divisive effect because, of course, European countries, particularly countries in the European Union, have continued to believe that the deal was a good deal and should continue to be respected. And some of these, of course, have come under these countries have come under very considerable pressure from the United States on this whole matter. So there was a relationship. I think the would-be President Biden has indicated two things. First, that he would allow the United States to rejoin the Paris Agreement on the environment, and also, it's understood, to rejoin the nuclear arrangement with Iran. And in that last respect, the most recent examinations by the International Atomic Energy Authority Association, I can't remember what the last A stands for, but the IAEA, has been that Iran continues to observe in detail the obligations which it accepted under that deal. So there could be a much improved relationship. There is another last point about Iran, and that, of course, if ever a country is in need of humanitarian assistance, it is Iran, because the consequences of the epidemic, which are largely concealed, have been very, very considerable indeed. And the Trump-inspired efforts, the sanctions, have been of very considerable impact on not the Republican Guard, but upon Iranian, what we might call ordinary Iranians. This is a country which is in dire need of assistance, and let's hope that if President Trump is not re-elected, it has done so far.
Lord Alexander, what will you advise Sayyid Hassan? Sorry?
Yeah, go on, sorry, yes.
What will you advise Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah if you sit with him face to face?
I wouldn't presume to give him advice, but I might have one or two questions for him, which would include, what is your purpose in life? Whose interests do you represent, and whose interests should you be representing? If the answer to those questions is the only possibly intellectually sustainable answer, which is I should be representing the interests of the public and what they desire to have in a peaceful world, then I think that he will be following the line which some others we've been talking about have been following, of focusing on constitutional government with a sound economy and a peaceful attitude to the world around him.
The same question goes for you, Mr. Lord Campbell.
Well, I've nothing, I think, to add much to what Alex was, but I was going to throw in respect for human rights and an acceptance of humanitarian obligations, because it seems to me that these are very important parts of a system, or let me put it this way, but somebody who wants to change a system should be motivated by these principles, because at their very heart they have the well-being of individuals and the collective well-being of societies.
There's another question. Lord Campbell, will you place Hezbollah and Hamas on terrorist list if the decision is yours?
Well, I'd certainly take it into account. What Alex Carlile indicated, very interesting illustration, was the activity that's going on in Doha at the moment. If that were to become commonplace and to be seen as long-lasting, then obviously a review would be required.
The same question goes for you also, Lord Alexander. Would you put Hezbollah and Hamas on terrorist list if the decision is yours?
Well, I think if the question is, would I take them off the terrorist list because they're already on it, then I think the answer would be not yet, no. I would want to see what happened in the negotiations, because there was a difference between having them on a terrorist list and actually doing anything about it, as in prosecuting people for membership, whilst they're working towards peace. And this is exactly what happened with the provisional IRA. Whilst one is working towards peace, they remain on a terrorism list. But what they do is taken into account in the discretionary executive actions of government. So there is, in my view, no contradiction between negotiating with, say, Hamas in Doha or with Hezbollah and keeping them on the terrorist list. But the aim would be, of course, to take them off the terrorist list. Nobody wants anyone on the terrorist list because it's a very expensive business administering a list like that. It's difficult to police. It involves all kinds of legal problems, which are faced certainly the British courts from time to time. And there are organizations which have voluntarily removed themselves from terrorist activity and been taken off the list. The Sikh youth movement was one. The MEK, the People's Mujahideen of Iran, was another one who gave up terrorism in 2001 and were removed by the British courts from the proscribed list. Government was ordered to remove them about 10 years later, a bit more than 10 years later. But it's a very good question because it recognizes that there is a tension when you're negotiating with people who you perhaps don't terribly like, but you have an end in view, which is for the benefit of the society in which they operate.
Can I just return, if I may, to that well-known expression, actions speak louder than words. When the actions are consistent with removal from a list, then obviously one would have regard to the need to have a review. But so long as there were actions inconsistent with removal, then I don't think there's any question of a removal being appropriate.
Allah, we have a question from Chelsea.
After
Yeah,
that,
we've got the quote.
okay, continue.
Yeah, we've got the question here. After the disaster that happened in Lebanon, do you think we as Lebanese are being treated fairly? In other words, are we being treated in a good way? Well, I think Lebanon could be treated much better than it's being treated at the present time. And it's not the fault of the citizens of Lebanon. You know, I have a friend, in fact, somebody who works for me as well, whose father-in-law lives in Beirut, and all the windows were blown out of his apartment. and he's living in the apartment, or he was living in the apartment until very recently in very difficult circumstances. He's a completely good person who is a successful businessman but plays no political part I'm aware of in the politics of Lebanon. The father-in-law of a friend of mine, another friend of mine, was killed in the explosion by flying glass. So the Lebanese people deserve not to suffer. The people of Beirut deserve to suffer as little as possible. But it is down to the politicians, I'm afraid. The politicians are going to have to create the circumstances in which the rest of the world is willing to give the maximum possible help to rebuild your great capital city and to help to rebuild your economy, which at one time was regarded as the most versatile and successful economy in your part of the globe.
And just to go back to an earlier theme, if there's any hint of corruption, then of course the willingness to make that kind of contribution will be completely undermined.
I mean, I have been very encouraged by seeing large numbers of people demonstrating peacefully on the streets of Beirut. It's not a quick process. If you look at what is happening in Belarus at the present time, hundreds of thousands of people are going onto the streets demonstrating peacefully, and then if they haven't been arrested by the police, going to work for 5 days of the week between their demonstrations. I think the power of the people is very, very strong, and this is much more significant than the Arab Spring, because there is a real focus for what has happened in Beirut, a terrible explosion, which as far as I can see, was brought about by either gross negligence or worse, by organizations with an interest in maintaining a very large amount of ammonium nitrate in a dockside warehouse, which is absolutely inexcusable. In the UK, the owners of that warehouse would be prosecuted for what is called gross negligence manslaughter and would end up in prison for many years as a result. So it's up to the politicians, but the people have got to get out there and persuade the politicians that what has happened and what continues to happen in Lebanese political life needs some retuning.
Do anyone have any other questions?
Okay. Thank you, Lord Alex Carlisle, Lord Campbell, for your amazing contribution. Thank you for everyone who participated in this webinar. I would like to have my sincere gratitude to our moderators, Muhammad and Ala. Thank you very much. I'm sure everyone who listened to this enjoyed this webinar. And as we discussed before we started the session, hopefully very soon we will see you, both our guests in Lebanon, in physical conference. I think your contribution is very important for the success of our country. Your political experience, especially looking at other cases, other countries, and having such a moderate and a logical approach. Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure hosting you with us today.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. It was our honor to be here.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.